Good morning and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. So this morning we have another sutta study session. Today we'll be going through the Moliyaphagguna Sutta, so Samyutta Nikaya 12.12, which is a discourse from the Nidana Samyutta. So we can start by paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll begin going through the discourse. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So, as mentioned, this morning we'll be looking at the Moliyaphagguna Sutta, which is from the Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 12, Sutta number 12. So I'll be going through this in Pali and giving some translation and explanation as we go along. And then I'll take any questions that you might have at the end. So the sutta begins, Savatiyang Viharati. So this is, the Buddha was dwelling at Savatthi. And the Buddha makes this opening statement. He says, Chattaro me bhikkhave ahara bhutanang va sattanang titya sambhavesinang va anugahaya. So this is the opening statement. So he's saying chattaro me, so there are these four. Ahara. So the word ahara literally means intake. So it's what we take in, it's what we consume. In English, it's sometimes translated as nutriment, which is a bit of an odd word in English. It's not a very commonly used word. But again, ahara literally means intake, what we bring into our body and mind, what builds up and nourishes and forms the basis for our body and mind. So he says there's these four kinds of intake, of consumption. Bhutanang va sattanang, so for beings who have come into existence. Titya sambhavesinang, so for the stabilizing of beings that have come into existence. Sambhavesinang anugahaya, or for supporting those who are seeking a state of existence, for those who are about to come into a state of being. So again, whether one has already taken on a particular form of existence or is currently between states of existence, then these four kinds of intake, or four kinds of consumption are the basis for that. He says, Katame chattaro, so what for? So the first one, kabalikaro. So this kabalikaro means physical food. So this is the most basic kind of consumption or intake that we're usually familiar with. So most people take in physical food several times a day, or usually at least once a day. And this is what builds up our body. That's what supports and maintains the physical body. So again, the first one, kabalikaro aharo, olariko va sukuma va. So olarika means coarse, and sukuma means refined. So I'm saying any kind of physical food that we take in, whether coarse or refined. And then next he gives three kinds of mental consumption or mental intake. So he says passo dutyo. So the second one is passa. Passa means sense contact, sensory experience. And then mano sanchetana tatya. So mano sanchetana. Mano means mind, and chetana means volition or intention. So the third kind of intake is mental volition, mental intentions. So what we focus the mind on, or what we form as a basis for action through the mind. And the fourth one, vinyanang chatutang, he says. The fourth one is consciousness. And he reiterates, he says, Eme ko bhikkhave chataro ahara bhutanang vasatanang titya sambhavesinang va anugahayati. So the Buddha says, these are the 4 kinds of nutriment that support existing beings and also those who are coming into existence. So just to reiterate, so that's physical food, which is the basis of the body. And then 3, which are the basis of the mind. So sense contact, so we're constantly ingesting or consuming sensory experiences. And manosa and cetana, so normally we would translate this as mental volition or mental intention. Though it's important to recognize that the word cetana or sancetana, although we normally translate it volition, it actually is from the verb which just means to think or to consider or to reflect on. In fact, it's the same root from which we get the word chitta, which just means mind. So manosancetana, again, we would commonly translate that as mental volition, but it could also be more generally put as thoughts or mental activities or mental processes. So in this sense, one can see how we're constantly ingesting or consuming mental objects, thoughts and memories and ideas and motivations and so on. And just as physical food builds up our physical body, in the same way, these forms of mental intake build up our mental body, builds up our construct of our mind. And the 4th one is vijnana, again, consciousness, which we usually understand as the awareness of our world. So for example, eye consciousness is the awareness of a visual world. So awareness that I am seeing those things. Or ear consciousness is the awareness of an auditory world. Awareness, I am hearing those things. So it's this formation of a conscious experience of a broader world. And in particular, the conscious experience of I am experiencing those things. So consciousness is one of the central and most deeply rooted foundations for our sense of self, for our sense of who we think we are. So then at this point, one of the monks in the audience asked the Buddha a question. So the sutta says, Evang vute ayasma Moliyaphagguna bhagavantang etadavocha. So when this was said, Venerable Moliyaphagguna said to the Blessed One, to the Fortunate One, and he asked this question. He says, Konu ko Bhante vijnana harang ahare titi. So he says, Bhante, who is it that consumes consciousness? Who is it that ingests consciousness? So his question here is, on the surface, it seems harmless enough. So the Buddha is talking about these 4 kinds of intake, these 4 kinds of consumption. And so Moliyaphagguna says, well, then who is it that consumes these things? Who is it that takes in these things? So who is it that takes in consciousness? And the Buddha's answer, the Buddha says, no kalo panho. So kalo means proper or appropriate or correct. So he says, and no kalo panho. So he says, this is not a proper question. This is not an appropriate question. This is not a relevant question. So in other words, he's saying, like, the question you're asking is, it doesn't fit. It doesn't apply in this circumstance. And he goes on to say, the Buddha continues, he says, ahare ti ahang navadami. So ahare means one ingests or one consumes. So the Buddha says, I don't say one consumes or one ingests. And he goes on to say, he says, ahare ti chahang vadeyang tatrasakalo panho konuko bhante ahare ti. The Buddha says, if I were to say one ingests, then it would be proper to ask, who is it that ingests? And he says, Evang chahang navadami, but he says, but I don't say that. He says, Evang mang avarantang yo evang pucheya. So he says, and since I don't say that, this would be the proper question. Kisanu ko bante vinyana haroti, eso kalo panho. So here the Buddha is saying, what is consciousness food for? So this is the proper question. So rather than saying who is it that ingests consciousness or who is it that intakes it, better it would be to ask, what is it for? What's its effect? What's its purpose? And he says, Tatra kalang veya karanang. He says, and this would be the proper explanation there. He says, Vinyana haro ayating punabhava benibhatya pachayo. So he says, the intake of consciousness has the result or the product of creating further existence in the future, of keeping us constantly generating more bhava, more states of being, more states of existence. He says, Tasming bhute sati salayatanang. And the Buddha says, based upon that state of existence, then there are the six senses, the salayatana, the sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought. He says, salayatana pachaya paso. And based upon those six senses, then there is contact. So here the Buddha also he's drawing a connection between consciousness and sense contact. So the Buddha is saying that by consuming or ingesting or fixating on the experience of consciousness, then what comes into being is the experience of the six senses, the six sensory domains. So what is consciousness? Again, it's the experience of self-awareness, of I am aware of other things. So then usually the next thing that we explore is like, how am I aware? In what ways am I aware of other things? And we start subdividing our experience. It's like, well, I am aware of sights. I am aware of sounds. I'm aware of smells and so on. And then based upon that, then we can describe sensory contact. We can describe seeing, smelling, tasting, and so on. So here the Buddha is drawing this connection between these two forms of intake, of consumption. So first we fixate on consciousness. We fixate on this experience of individuality, of personal awareness. And then based upon that, we start looking for sensory experiences to intake, to consume. And then Moliyaphagguna asks another question. And by the way, it should be pointed out that the problem with Moliyapagguna's question, so Moliyaphagguna asks, who ingests consciousness? So the problem there is that Moliyaphagguna is already assuming that there's some kind of persistent, ongoing being. There's some kind of persistent, ongoing person, which has some kind of inherent self-existence, which then experiences consciousness and experiences sense contact and so on. So whereas what the Buddha is describing is the Buddha is describing how a series of impersonal processes, impersonal cause and effect processes, generates the illusion of individual existence, generates the illusion of persistent individual people, creates the illusion of a self, of a soul, of an ongoing being, an ongoing entity. But that fundamentally, when we look closely at what's actually going on, we don't find a person, we just find a process which is unfolding based upon cause and effect. So, but Moliyaphagguna clearly doesn't get this from the Buddha's first answer. So then Moliyaphagguna says, Kono ko Bhante pusati. He says, so Bhante, who is it that has sense contact? Who is it that contacts the senses? And again, the Buddha says, this is not an appropriate question. It's not a relevant question. It's not a proper question. And he says, I don't say that there's a person who contacts. I don't say that there is a person who has sensory contact. And he says, if I did say such a thing, then you could ask, who is it that has sensory contact? And he says, but since I don't say that, better it would be to ask, what is the condition for sense contact? Or based upon what is there the condition of sense contact? So king pachayanu ko bhante pasoti. What is the condition for sense contact? Under what conditions does one experience sense contact? He says, then one can say, salayatana pachaya paso, pasa pachaya vedana. So when there is the six senses, then there is sensory contact. And based upon sensory contact, there is vedana, there is feeling. So here the Buddha is starting to unfold a little bit of the chain of causal sequences, which we usually know of as paticca samuppada, dependent origination. But this is just a little fragment of it, a little snapshot. So again, previously the Buddha said, based upon consciousness, then there comes into being the experience of ongoing renewed existence. And based upon the experience of ongoing existence or renewed existence, then there are the six senses. And based on the six senses, there is sense contact. And here he's saying, based upon sense contact, there is feeling. So again, what the Buddha is pointing to here is that this is a causal process which unfolds according to the laws of nature. There's no need to create the idea of a persistent, ongoing person. Instead, we can just observe the causal process as being an impersonal function of nature. And again, Moliyaphagguna doesn't quite get it. So then he says, Kono ko Bhante vedeti. He's saying, well, Bhante, who is it that feels? And again, the Buddha says, this is not a proper question. And he says, if I had said that there's a person who feels, then you could ask, who is it that feels? But I don't say that. And since I don't say that, then this is what one should ask. One should ask, King Pachayanu ko Bhante Vedana. So what is the condition based on which there is feeling? So based on what condition is the experience of Vedana, of feeling? And he says, then one could properly explain, Pasapachaya Vedana. So based on the condition of sense contact, then there is Vedana, there is feeling. He says, Vedana Pachaya Tanha. And based upon Vedana, there is Tanha, there is craving. So Vedana is the experience of pleasure and pain. So when we feel something pleasant, then we have craving for more pleasantness. So maybe you have some pleasant food, you have a nice breakfast or something. So then the mind has craving for more. Or maybe actually you have a terrible breakfast and then you have a craving for something better, something more enjoyable. Or if you have a painful experience, then you have the craving to avoid that pain, to remove it, to replace it with something you like better. So whether it's craving for more pleasant or less painful, either way, Vedana, so the experience of pleasure and pain, tends to be the basis for craving, for the arising of craving, of desires. And so Moliyaphagguna, again, not quite getting the point, Moliyaphagguna then asks another question. He says, Kono ko Bhante tasati. So he's saying, so who is it that craves? And again, the Buddha says, this is not the right question. I don't say there is one who craves. He says, if I did say there was one who craves, then you could ask, who is it that craves? But since I don't say that, the right question would be, King Pachayanu ko Bhante tanha. The right question would be, based upon what is there craving? What is the condition for the arising of craving? And he says, Tatra kalang veya karanang. Says, and there the proper explanation is, Vedana pachaya tanha, tanha pachaya upadanang. So Vedana pachaya tanha. So based upon Vedana, then there is tanha. Based upon feeling, there is craving. And tanha pachaya upadanang. Based on tanha, craving, there is upadana. So upadana means grasping. When you try to grab hold of something. So grasping at something or trying to, either trying to acquire something or trying to hold on to something you've already acquired. And Moliyaphagguna, still not quite getting the hint. Moliyaphagguna says, Konuko Bhante upadiyati. So he says, well, Bhante, who is it that grasps? And again, the Buddha says, this is not the right question. I don't say there is one who grasps. If I said there is one who grasps, then you could ask that question. But he says, I don't say this. And since I don't say this, the proper question would be, King Pachayanu ko Bhante upadana. So what is the condition for the arising of grasping? Based upon what does grasping arise? And he says, there one could explain, Tanha pachaya upadanang, upadana pachaya bhavo. So he says, based upon tanha, based on craving, there is upadana, there is grasping. And based upon grasping, there is bhava, there is coming into being. There are states of existence. And then he goes on from that to say that, and then based upon existence, then there is birth, aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. So there's the whole mass of suffering, the whole mass of dukkha. So once we've taken on the experience of a state of existence, whether it's as a human or whether it's a particular self-identity, so bhava could also be understood to mean a self-identity. So any kind of concept of me, who I am. So once we've taken on a self-identity, then we become subject to suffering. We become subject to birth, decay, sickness, death. We become subject to loss. We become subject to not getting what we want or getting what we don't want. We become caught in the whole painful cycle of samsara, of the impermanence and unreliability of pleasant experiences, of the difficulties that come from trying to hold on to something which is constantly disintegrating, namely our own body and mind. And also recognizing that whatever self-identity we form, it's a self-identity based upon something which is itself impermanent and unreliable. So our self-identity, which we try so desperately to hold on to and constantly reinforce, that self-identity itself is based upon something hollow, something empty, something insubstantial, something fleeting. So then the Buddha summarizes. He says, Chanang tveva paguna pasa yatananang asesa viraga nirodha. So he's saying, however, Paguna, when the 6 bases for sense contact cease entirely through dispassion. So asesa viraga nirodha. So asesa means without remainder, with nothing left over or completely. Viraga means through dispassion or based upon dispassion, the absence of lust and obsession. And nirodha means cessation. So the Buddha is saying that when one cultivates dispassion towards sensory experiences, then the 6 senses of base contact can disappear. They no longer arise because there's no longer a basis for them to arise. So ultimately, it's desire, it's passion, it's obsession, which leads to us constantly seeking sensory experiences, to try to gratify ourselves, to try to find something that's pleasant or enjoyable, or something that will reinforce our sense of self, something that will reinforce our self-identity. So that constant seeking for something gratifying, something pleasant, something self-affirming is exactly what keeps creating this experience of the six senses of sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought, which keeps creating this container for suffering, which we call body and mind, nama rupa, body and mind. But the Buddha says, when through dispassion, there's the complete cessation of the six senses, he says, then passa nirodho, then sensory contact stops. And when sensory contact stops, then feeling stops. So passa nirodha, vedana nirodho. If we're not having sensory experiences, then there's no pleasure and pain. It says vedana nirodha, tanha nirodho. And when there's no pleasure and pain, then there's no craving. Tanha nirodha, upadana nirodho. So when there's no craving, then there's when craving stops, then grasping stops. Upadana nirodha, bhava nirodho. When grasping stops, then personal existence stops. So this constant generating of a self-identity comes to an end. So our self-identity is based upon our desires, on our grasping, on our attachments. So when we stop grasping and desiring and attaching, then self-identity dissolves. It has no basis, so it dissolves, disappears. And he says, bhava nirodha, jati nirodho. So when personal existence, when self-identity stops, then birth stops. Jati nirodha, jara maranang soka parideva dukkha domana supayasa nirujanti. And he says, and when birth stops, then decay, death, sorrow, anguish, pain, depression, despair, all these things also stop. And he says, eva me tassa kevalasa dukkha khandasa nirodho hoti. So it says, in this way, there is the ending of this whole massive dukkha. There's the cessation, the stopping of this whole experience of dukkha. So again, here he's pointing to the fact that our self-identity, so based upon sensory contact, we build up a sense of self, a sense of me, a sense of self-identity connected with the kind of sensory experiences that we like and the kind that we don't like, and what we think this is and what we think that is. So we're building up our sense of self through these four nutriments, of food, sensory contact, of mental activities and consciousness. Then we build up this sense of self. And this sense of self then is the basis of all of our suffering. So the Buddha here is saying, like, when we practice dispassion, when we practice letting go of our passion, our obsession, our lust for things, for experiences, for self-identities, for anything at all, in fact, then this whole process grinds to a halt. And we start to recognize that every single component in this process is insubstantial. It's hollow. There's nothing solid here, and there's nothing personal here. This is all just a description of nature, of these natural processes of cause and effect. And when we clearly recognize that, then our dukkha also evaporates. Our dukkha also stops. Because it no longer has anywhere to land. It no longer has anything to stick to. So that's a summary of this particular sutta. So the Moliyaphagguna Sutta, Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 12, sutta number 12. So this time we can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And if there's any questions or comments, I could take questions and comments at this time. So first off, hello to all the people joining in online. So hello to Usha, Jayanta, Sud, Aurora, Douglas, Rocky, Jessica, Cheering, Richard, Nan and Jessica, good to see all of you. And also hello to everyone else who's watching online. And I don't see any questions online. Are there any questions from the monastery residents? No? Yeah, go ahead.
Can you call Manosanchetana as mental constructions?
You could, but that's getting, I would prefer to use that for Sankhara. So Sankhara more clearly means constructions. Sanchetana means more like thinking or activities. Yeah, it's more like mental activities.
So Sanchetana, so we are constructing thoughts.
Yeah, I mean it's a subtle distinction because I mean the difference between Mano Sankhara and Mano Sanchetana, it's effectively the same thing. There's not a big difference there. It's more of a slight linguistic difference. So again, Chaitana has the meaning of thinking, whereas Sankhara has the meaning of building, of constructing, of putting something together. But it winds up meaning basically the same thing, because when you're thinking, you're putting together a mental object. So it winds up having basically the same meaning.
It's happening in the mind.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, anything else? Okay, so we can go ahead and conclude the session with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.